Andrew Jackson weaponized the presidency. Convinced that political slander had stopped his wife's heart, he entered the White House with a single, terrifying purpose: not to lead the nation, but to destroy the men who murdered his wife. He turned the highest office in the land into an instrument of personal retribution. This is the bloody reality of the revenge presidency. Born in 1767, just weeks after his father's death, Jackson grew up in the Waxhaw's wilderness, a place where life was cheap and backing down meant disappearing. The American Revolution crashed onto his doorstep, not as a debate, but as a bloody reality. At 13, while a captive of the British, he refused to clean an officer's boots and received a saber blow to the head. He carried that scar and a searing hatred for the British Empire for the rest of his life. But the war took more than his blood. It took his entire world. Disease and hardship claimed his brothers and his mother, leaving him an orphan at 14. He had no parents, no inheritance, and nothing but a heart filled with cold, sharpening rage. This utter isolation created the fatal weakness that would define his life, a pathological need for loyalty. Jackson viewed the world as a battlefield where one was either a staunch ally or a mortal enemy. He was a drifting soul until he arrived in Nashville and laid eyes on Rachel Donaldson Robards. She was trapped in an abusive marriage, and Jackson, the man who had lost everything, finally found something he was willing to burn the world to protect. Nashville, in 1788, was not a city. It was a fortification against the wilderness, a place where civilization felt temporary. It was here, in the widow Donaldson's blockhouse, that Andrew Jackson found the family he had been craving. But it came with a volatile complication. Rachel Donaldson was 21 years old, described by contemporaries as irresistible, a woman of profound warmth and black-eyed vivacity. But behind her smile lay a terrifying reality. She was married to Louis Robards, a man whose jealousy bordered on psychosis. Robards was not merely a bad husband, he was a tormentor. He was prone to violent rages, accusing Rachel of infidelity with any man who simply offered a polite conversation. He had already banished her once, only to take her back and resume the cycle of psychological torture. Jackson, the young prosecutor with the scars of war on his face and a hair-triggered temper, moved into the Donaldson cabin as a boarder. He immediately sensed the danger lurking in the household. He watched as Robards berated Rachel, his jealousy now fixing its paranoid gaze upon Jackson himself. For Jackson, seeing a woman, especially one as kind and maternal as Rachel, being bullied, triggered his deepest protective instincts. The orphan boy who had been helpless to save his mother from disease was now a man who would not stand by while a woman was destroyed by cruelty. The tension in the cabin became suffocating. Robards, fueled by suspicion, publicly humiliated Rachel and eventually abandoned her, storming off to Kentucky with threats that he would return to drag her back. The situation escalated from domestic misery to a life-or-death crisis. Word reached Nashville that Robards was indeed returning, not to reconcile, but to claim his property by force. Rachel was terrified. She resolved to flee down the dangerous river to Natchez, Mississippi, a Spanish territory where she had family friends. But the river was crawling with bandits and hostile tribes. A woman traveling alone was essentially signing her own death warrant. Seeing her desperation, Jackson made the decision that would seal his fate. He volunteered to accompany her as armed protection. In the eyes of the law, he was a single man traveling with a married woman. In his own eyes, he was a knight protecting a damsel from a monster. The journey to Natchez was perilous, drifting on a flatboat through dark, silent waters, always watching the tree lines for ambush. It was in this crucible of danger and shared vulnerability that their bond shifted. Surrounded by the threat of death from the riverbanks and the threat of ruin from society back home, Jackson and Rachel fell deeply, irrevocably in love. He saw in her the gentleness he lacked. She saw in him the strength she desperately needed. By the time they reached the safety of Natchez, they were no longer just protector and refugee. They were soulmates, bound by a shared trauma and a dangerous secret. They believed Robards had forfeited his rights as a husband through his cruelty. They believed they were morally free, but the law is cold and unyielding, and they were about to make a mistake that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The catastrophe that would eventually destroy Andrew Jackson's happiness was rooted in the geopolitical map of 1791. It was a time when borders were not just lines on paper, they were the difference between life and death, between law and lawlessness. Andrew Jackson and Rachel Donaldson had fled the violent, suffocating orbit of her husband Louis Robards in Nashville. They had drifted hundreds of miles down the Mississippi River, navigating through Chickasaw territory, past river pirates, and into the humid, moss-draped sanctuary of Natchez. At that time, Natchez was not American soil. It was Spanish territory. It was a world of Catholic mysticism, strict royal decrees, and a languid pace of life that felt entirely detached from the puritanical rigidity of the American frontier. In this foreign paradise, the air smelled of jasmine and river mud. For the first time in years, Rachel Donaldson stopped looking over her shoulder. The physical threat of Louis Robards felt a million miles away. To Andrew Jackson, this woman was no longer just the daughter of his landlady. She was a survivor he had pulled from the wreckage. He was 24, a young prosecutor with a fierce pride and a scar on his head from a British saber. He looked at Rachel and saw something fragile that needed a fortress. He decided then and there that he would be that fortress. But in the quiet of this Spanish refuge, they made a catastrophic error. They let their guard down. They assumed that distance equaled safety. They assumed that because they felt morally right, the law would naturally align with them. It was a mistake born of arrogance and exhaustion, the fatal belief that love could overwrite the cold, hard statutes of men. The disaster began with a whisper. In the late 18th century, news traveled slowly, passed from rider to rider, distorted by memory and bias. A messenger arrived from the north, bringing news from Kentucky where Louis Robards lived. The report was fragmentary but explosive. Louis Robards had gone to the Virginia state legislature. He had petitioned for a divorce. The legislature, the rumor claimed, had passed an act dissolving the marriage. To the modern mind, a divorce is a judicial process, a stack of paperwork filed in a clerk's office. But in 1791, in the infant United States, divorce was almost legally impossible. It was a legislative act reserved for the most extreme circumstances. It required the sovereign power of the state to sever what God had joined. When Jackson heard that the Virginia legislature had acted, his legal training, usually so sharp, failed him completely. He heard what he wanted to hear. He interpreted the news through the filter of his own desire. To him, the message meant one thing: the monster had cut the cord. Rachel was free. He did not ask to see the transcript. He did not send a writer to Richmond to verify the seal of the Commonwealth. He did not pause to consider that Louis Robards, a man defined by his vindictive jealousy, might be playing a longer, darker game. Jackson simply accepted the rumor as gospel. In August 1791, in the opulent home of a wealthy friend in Natchez, believed to be the plantation of Thomas Green, Andrew Jackson took Rachel Donaldson's hand. In a ceremony whose precise details have been lost to the fog of history, they exchanged vows. It was a moment of blinding, delirious triumph. Jackson believed he had stolen a victory from the jaws of tragedy. He had saved the damsel. He had married the love of his life. They stood on the banks of the Mississippi, believing they were starting a new chapter. In reality, they were signing a confession. What Jackson failed to uncover, the forensic detail that would lie buried like a landmine for 30 years, was the specific wording of the Virginia legislature's action. Louis Robards had indeed gone to the legislature, but the assembly had not granted him a divorce. They had not dissolved the marriage. They had merely passed an enabling act. This act granted Robards the permission to sue for divorce in a court of law, provided he could prove his claims before a jury. It was not a verdict. It was a green light to start a trial. Why does this technicality matter? It matters because of the timeline. Robards had the permission to sue in the winter of 1790 to 1791. But he did not file the suit immediately. He waited. This is where the story shifts from a legal misunderstanding to a psychological thriller. Louis Robards was a man consumed by jealousy, yes, but he was also possessed of a cruel reptilian patience. He knew Rachel had fled with Jackson. He knew they were in Natchez. He suspected that given enough time and false hope, they would cross the line. If Robards had sued for divorce immediately in early 1791, his grounds would have been weak. Cruelty, abandonment, these were difficult to prove in a patriarchal court system that viewed wives as property. But if he waited, if he let them believe they were free, if he let them marry, then his grounds for divorce would shift. He would no longer need to prove she was unhappy. He would only need to prove she was with another man. By marrying Rachel in Natchez before the divorce was finalized, Andrew Jackson walked directly into the trap. He handed Louis Robards the ultimate weapon. For 2 years, the Jacksons lived in a fool's paradise. They returned to Nashville in the fall of 1791, radiating the confidence of a power couple. They built a home. They navigated the social circles of the frontier. Jackson was rising, attorney general, a land speculator, a man of consequence. Rachel was the gracious mistress of his estate, finally smiling again, finally safe. Every day of those 2 years was a lie. Every morning they woke up together. Every meal they shared. Every public appearance they made as Mr. and Mrs. Jackson. It was all evidence. In the eyes of their neighbors, they were husband and wife. But in the cold, unblinking eyes of the law, Rachel was still the legal property of Louis Robards. Therefore, every single moment of her life with Jackson was, by definition, a criminal act. The clock ticked. The trap remained set. Robards watched from Kentucky gathering his proof. He didn't just want a divorce anymore. He wanted destruction. He wanted to brand Rachel with a mark that would never wash off. The hammer finally dropped in late 1793. Jackson was traveling on the Cumberland Road when he likely first heard the whispers. Then came the official documents, carried by a courier whose saddlebags held the ruin of Jackson's honor. The news was shattering. Louis Robards had finally gone to the Court of Quarter Sessions in Mercer County, Kentucky, to exercise the right the legislature had given him years ago. He was suing for divorce now. Jackson must have frozen, his mind racing to catch up with the horror of reality. Suing now, but we are already married. Then he read the charge. The document did not cite the years of abuse Rachel had suffered. It did not mention Robards' own infidelity or his cruel abandonment. It cited a specific, undeniable fact. The verdict, delivered by a jury of 12 men who knew nothing of Rachel's suffering, was brutal in its sterile simplicity. The defendant, Rachel Robards, hath deserted the plaintiff, Louis Robards, and hath and doth still live in adultery with another man. The words burned on the page, adultery. But the legal implications were even worse. Because Jackson and Rachel had undergone a marriage ceremony in Natchez, while her first marriage was still valid, she was not just an adulteress. She was a bigamist. The fatal mistake was revealed in all its ugly dimensions. Jackson, the protector, the man who would duel anyone who dared look at his wife with disrespect, had failed in his most basic duty. He had failed to check the paperwork. He had let his arrogance, his belief that his will could bend reality, blind him to the procedural danger. Imagine the scene at their home when Jackson had to break the news to her. Rachel, a woman of deep, trembling piety, a woman who feared God and cherished her reputation, had to be told that she was living in sin. She had to be told that her marriage was a sham. She had to be told that in the eyes of the law, she was a criminal. The shame was absolute. For a woman in the 18th century South, the label of adulteress was a social death sentence. It stripped her of her virtue, her standing, and her dignity. There was only one way to fix it. They had to sanitize the record. They had to marry again. In January 1794, on a gray, bleak day in Nashville, Andrew Jackson and Rachel Donaldson stood before a justice of the peace. The atmosphere could not have been more different from the romantic haze of Natchez. There was no joy here. There was no celebration. The air was thick with humiliation and a quiet, seething rage. They had to repeat their vows. They had to sign the ledger. By performing this second ceremony, they were publicly admitting that the first one was invalid. They were signing a confession that for the past 3 years, they had been living in an illicit union. They were validating Robard's accusations. Jackson stood there, his face pale, his blue eyes burning with a cold, terrifying light. He was fixing the legal error, yes. He was making her his lawful wife, finally and truly. But he knew the damage was done. He knew that somewhere in a courthouse basement in Kentucky, there was a file that contained the dates, a file that contained the verdict of adultery, a file that proved his wife was a bigamist. He likely told himself that he could bury it, that he could intimidate anyone who dared to whisper about it, that his reputation as a violent, dangerous man would keep their mouths shut. But deep down, in the detective part of his brain, Jackson knew the truth. He had handed his enemies a loaded gun. He had placed a weapon in the hands of every rival he would ever face. The fatal mistake of 1791 didn't just cause a legal headache, it reshaped Andrew Jackson's soul. It stripped away the last remnants of his youthful optimism and replaced it with a permanent paranoid vigilance. He became a man who scanned every room for insults. He became a man who viewed every political attack not as a debate, but as a potential threat to Rachel's existence. He realized that he had been the one to expose her. His love, so fierce and consuming, had been the very thing that made her vulnerable. The guilt of this realization would fuel his fury for the rest of his life. He wasn't just fighting for her honor anymore. He was fighting to absolve himself of his own negligence. The tragedy of Andrew Jackson is that he spent his entire life trying to protect Rachel from the consequences of a mistake he had made. He built a wall of fire around her, challenging anyone to cross it. But he couldn't protect her from the past. He couldn't burn the records in Kentucky. As they walked out of that second wedding ceremony in 1794, the ghost of Louis Robards didn't disappear. It merely stepped back into the shadows, waiting. It would wait for 30 years. It would wait until Jackson reached for the highest power in the land. And then, in 1828, it would emerge to claim its final deadly price. The trap had been sprung. The fatal mistake was irrevocable. The long, slow march toward the tragedy of the White House had officially begun. The violence that Andrew Jackson carried within him was a direct reflection of the brutal rules governing his world. Tennessee in 1806 was not governed by statutes, policemen, or courts of law. It was governed by the Code Duello. This was not the chaotic, impulsive gunfighting seen in Western movies. It was a rigid, aristocratic liturgy of death, inherited from Europe and adapted to the savage realities of the American frontier. In this unforgiving society, a man's reputation was his only currency. If a man lost his credit, he could rebuild his fortune. If he lost his land, he could move west. But if he lost his honor, he became a ghost, socially dead long before his body hit the ground. For Andrew Jackson, honor had a specific sacred name, Rachel. The fatal mistake of the previous years had not vanished into history. Instead, it had festered in the dark corners of Nashville society. The whisper of bigamy had traveled from the courthouses to the taverns and finally to the racetracks, where the wealthy elite gathered to gamble and gossip. It was here that Jackson encountered his dark reflection, a man who represented everything he was not. Charles Dickinson was 27 years old, the golden boy of Tennessee society. He was wealthy, brilliant, arrogant, and possessed of a skill that made him the most feared man in the state. He was an impeccable marksman. It was widely said that Dickinson could sever a string at 24 paces without trembling. He was young, he was fast, and he knew it. The conflict ostensibly began over a horse race. Jackson's prized thoroughbred Truxton was set to race against a horse owned by Dickinson's father-in-law. When the race was canceled and a forfeit fee was disputed, the argument should have ended with lawyers and settlements. But Dickinson, fueled by liquor and the arrogance of youth, knew Jackson's weak point. He knew exactly where the armor was thin. In a Nashville tavern surrounded by an audience of drinking men, Dickinson made a remark. He didn't just insult Jackson's horse or his integrity as a sportsman. He uttered a slur about Rachel. He dragged the bigamous history out of the shadows and threw it onto the barroom floor. When word of the insult reached Jackson, the fatal weakness took over. The protective obsession that defined his life engaged like a mechanical gear. For Jackson, an attack on Rachel was not mere slander. It was an assassination attempt on his soul. He did not scream. He did not throw a punch. He demanded satisfaction. He challenged the best shot in the state to a duel. It was a decision that seemed, to any rational observer, like a suicide pact. Jackson was 39 years old, skinny and sickly. Dickinson was in his prime and had never missed a target. On May 30th, 1806, the two parties rode north to Harrison's Mills, Kentucky. Dueling was technically illegal in Tennessee, so they had to cross the state line to the banks of the Red River to carry out their grim business. The strategy Jackson formulated during that long, silent ride reveals the terrifying coldness of his intellect. He analyzed the physics of the coming confrontation with the detachment of a coroner. He knew that Dickinson was faster on the draw. Whatever happened, Dickinson would fire first. If Jackson tried to snap shoot, to raise his pistol and fire as quickly as possible, the best he could hope for was a rushed shot, a miss, and likely his own death. So Andrew Jackson made a decision that defies the human survival instinct. He decided to let himself be shot. He reasoned that the shock of being hit might spoil his aim if he fired simultaneously. Therefore, he would stand still. He would absorb the bullet. He would take the pain. And then while bleeding, he would take his time, aim deliberately, and execute Charles Dickinson. It was a strategy born of pure, cold hatred. He was willing to die, provided he could take Dickinson with him. The morning of the duel was damp and gray. The two men stood 24 feet apart, that is 8 yards, a terrifyingly short distance, roughly the length of a large living room. Dickinson stood sideways, presenting a slim profile to minimize the target, a classic duelist stance. Jackson stood differently. He wore a navy blue frock coat that was purposefully too large for his gaunt frame. He had buttoned it across his chest in a way that created a billowing fold of fabric over his torso. It was a visual trick, a distortion intended to confuse Dickinson about the exact location of his heart. The second Thomas Overton shouted the command, "Fire!" Dickinson was a blur of motion. His pistol snapped up and detonated almost instantly. The sound was a loud, cracking thunderclap that rolled across the river. A puff of dust flew from the chest of Jackson's coat. Dickinson watched through the smoke, expecting the man to fall. He waited for the crumple of knees, the gasp of death. But as the smoke cleared, Andrew Jackson was standing there, rigid, unmoving, like a statue carved from hickory wood. Dickinson's composure shattered. The psychological shock was greater than any physical blow. He actually stepped back from his mark, his eyes wide with horror, gasping, "Great God, have I missed him?" Overton roared, "Back to the mark, sir." According to the rigid rules of the Code Duello, Dickinson was now helpless. He had fired his shot. He had to stand there, unarmed, and wait to die. He had to watch his executioner prepare. Now, look closely at Andrew Jackson. He was hit. Dickinson's bullet had smashed into his chest, shattered 2 ribs, and lodged inches from his heart. The only reason it missed the vital organ was the loose fit of the coat, and Jackson's unnaturally thin frame, which sat slightly to the left of where Dickinson had aimed. His left boot was slowly filling with warm blood. The pain must have been blinding, a searing heat tearing through his lung. But Jackson didn't flinch. His face was a mask of Old Testament judgment. He slowly raised his pistol. He took aim at the man who had slandered his wife. He pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The hammer stopped at half-cock. It was a misfire. In a normal street fight, this would be a miracle for Dickinson, a chance to run or reload. But the Code Duello is cruel. The rules stated that a misfire did not count as a shot. Jackson was allowed to try again. Imagine the horror of Charles Dickinson in that moment. He had to stand frozen and watch this man, this bleeding demon who refused to fall, recock the pistol. He heard the mechanical click of the hammer being pulled back. He saw Jackson take a breath, steadying his hand despite the blood pouring from his chest. Jackson leveled the sight at Dickinson's groin, then slowly raised it to his abdomen. The second gunshot was deeper, more final. The ball tore through Dickinson's body, severing his bowel. He collapsed into the grass, bleeding to death in agony over the course of a long, miserable day. Jackson walked away from the dueling ground with a bullet in his chest that surgeons could never remove. It stayed there for the next 39 years, rattling in his lung, causing him chronic pain, lead poisoning, and coughing fits that would rack his body until his death. But as they rode away, his friend asked him how he could stand so still, how he could maintain such composure after being shot point blank. Jackson's reply was the epitaph of his character, a sentence that reveals the depth of his vengeful soul. "I should have hit him if he had shot me through the brain." This event highlights the drama-filled contradiction of Andrew Jackson's life. To the public, he had won. He had defended his wife's honor in the ultimate trial by combat. But in reality, he had lost. The killing of Charles Dickinson did not silence the whispers. It amplified them. Jackson was branded a violent man, a cold-blooded killer who shot a defenseless rival. He was ostracized by polite society. For years, he was a political pariah, viewed as a savage unfit for civilized governance. And physically, he was broken. The pain from that bullet became a constant companion, a physical manifestation of the scandal that refused to die. Every time he coughed, Every time he felt that ache in his chest, he was reminded of the fatal mistake of 1791. He had killed the man who spoke the words, but he could not kill the words themselves. The bullet in his chest was a grim souvenir, a reminder that while you can kill a man, you cannot murder the truth. Rachel was safe for now, shielded by the terrifying reputation of her husband, but the detectives of history were still watching. The road to the White House was now paved with blood, and the price of that blood would eventually be paid by the very woman he sought to save. If the duel with Dickinson was a physical battle, the years that followed were a psychological siege. Andrew Jackson returned to Nashville not as a conquering hero, but as a pariah. The killing of Charles Dickinson, a popular, wealthy, and well-connected young man, had violated the invisible boundary of social acceptability. It was one thing to defend one's honor. It was another to kill a man in cold blood after he had already missed. The gentlemen of Tennessee turned their backs. When Jackson walked into a tavern, silence followed. When he entered a courtroom, eyes averted. He was branded a savage, a man with a temper like a volcano and a heart of flint. For Rachel, this ostracization was a different kind of torture. She was a woman of profound social instincts, raised in a large, boisterous family who thrived on connection and community. Now she found the doors of polite society bolted shut. The whispers about her bigamy had been amplified by the gunshot that killed Dickinson. Every time Jackson coughed, a hacking, rattling cough caused by the bullet lodged in his chest, it was a sonic reminder of the scandal. She knew that he was in pain because of her. She knew he had killed because of her. The guilt was a heavy, suffocating blanket that she wore every day. In response to this rejection, Jackson did what he always did when threatened. He built a fortress. In 1804, they had purchased a 425-acre tract of land that would become known as the Hermitage. In these early years, it was not the grand white-columned mansion that tourists visit today. It was a cluster of rough-hewn log cabins, sturdy and functional, surrounded by cotton fields and dense woods. It was a working farm, but more importantly, it was a sanctuary. The name itself, the Hermitage, was a declaration of intent. It was a place of retreat, a place to hide from a world that judged them. Here, in the isolation of the countryside, the tragic romance deepened into a bond that was almost symbiotic. Cut off from the outside world, they turned entirely to each other. Jackson, the violent duelist who terrified men, became a different creature within the walls of the Hermitage. Observers who managed to penetrate their inner circle were shocked to see the wild man of Tennessee sitting quietly by the fire, reading the Bible while Rachel smoked her clay pipe. He was gentle with her, almost reverent. He deferred to her judgment on moral matters. She was the only human being on earth who could command him. When his temper flared, when his face turned red and his blue eyes went cold, Rachel would simply place a hand on his shoulder and say, "Mr. Jackson, remember yourself," and the storm would pass. But there was a silence in the Hermitage that no amount of love could fill. It was the silence of a nursery. Jackson and Rachel had no biological children. For a man obsessed with legacy and a woman defined by her maternal warmth, this was a profound, unspoken tragedy. The physiological reasons remain a mystery of history, but the psychological impact is clear. The lack of an heir gnawed at Jackson. He was a man building an empire of land and reputation, but he had no bloodline to inherit it. For Rachel, the pain was more immediate. She saw children as a blessing from God, and her barrenness felt like another judgment, another sign that perhaps the vicious whispers of society were right about her sinfulness. To fill this void, they turned the Hermitage into an orphanage of sorts. They didn't just host guests, they collected family. In 1808, Rachel's brother, Severn Donaldson, gave birth to twins. Since Rachel could not conceive, her brother and his wife allowed the Jacksons to adopt one of the boys. They named him Andrew Jackson Jr. The adoption was immediate and total. Jackson, the man who had shot Charles Dickinson in the gut, became a doting father who would walk the floorboards at night with a crying infant in his arms. He poured all his thwarted paternal instincts into the boy. Later, they would take in other wards, nephews, nieces, and most famously Lincoya, a Creek Indian orphan found on a battlefield. This behavior reveals the drama-filled contradiction at the core of his character. The man who could slaughter his enemies without blinking was capable of overwhelming tenderness toward the vulnerable. He was a killer to the world, but a savior to his chosen tribe. Yet despite the domestic tranquility they tried to manufacture, Jackson was a tiger in a cage. The farming life of the Hermitage, while profitable, could not satisfy the restless energy that boiled inside him. He was a man of action, condemned to a life of cotton ledgers and horse breeding. The bullet in his chest leaked lead into his bloodstream, causing chronic headaches, dysentery, and a temper that grew shorter by the year. He felt he was rotting away. He watched the news from Europe, where Napoleon was redrawing the map of the world, and he watched the tensions rising between the United States and Great Britain. He hated the British with a holy fire. The scars on his head from the Revolutionary War officer's sword still burned. He believed that the British were inciting the Native American tribes on the frontier, paying for American scalps, and disrespecting the sovereignty of his fragile young nation. He saw the weakness of the federal government in Washington, a government of talkers and bureaucrats, and he despised it. He yearned for a chance to prove himself, to wash away the stain of the Dickinson duel with the glory of military service. Rachel watched him pace the floorboards of the Hermitage. She saw the distant look in his eyes. She knew that her fortress could not hold him forever. She prayed for peace because she knew that war would take him away from her. But she also knew that war was the only thing that could restore his reputation. The fatal weakness was shifting. His obsession with protecting Rachel was expanding. He began to conflate Rachel with America itself. Both were virtuous, both were under attack by corrupt, aristocratic enemies, and both needed a violent champion to defend them. He started to view the coming conflict not just as a geopolitical struggle, but as a personal vendetta written on a national scale. By 1812, the Hermitage was no longer just a home, it was a waiting room. The isolation that was meant to protect them had become a prison. The scandal of the marriage had quieted down, not because people had forgiven them, but because they had forgotten them. Jackson was an aging, sickly lawyer with a bad reputation. History seemed ready to leave him behind, but history has a way of finding the men who are willing to bleed for it. In June 1812, the news finally arrived. The United States had declared war on Great Britain. The War of 1812 had begun. For most Americans, it was a terrifying prospect. For Andrew Jackson, it was a resurrection. He looked at Rachel, the woman he had shielded behind the logs of the Hermitage for 6 years, and prepared to leave her. He believed that the only way to truly protect her honor was to return as a hero so undeniable that no one would ever dare whisper the word bigamist again. He was wrong. The war would make him a hero, yes. It would make him a legend. But it would also expose Rachel to a level of scrutiny that the walls of the Hermitage could never withstand. The knight was riding out to slay the dragon, unaware that by opening the gates, he was letting the monsters in. The miracle that occurred on the banks of the Mississippi River in January 1815 defies logical explanation, especially when looking past the marble statues to the ruin of the man standing at the center of the storm. In late 1814, Andrew Jackson was not the vibrant warrior of legend. He was a 47-year-old wreck who looked closer to 70, a man physically disintegrating under the weight of his own violent history. His body was a catalog of agony. He was skeletal and yellowed with jaundice, battling a ferocious case of chronic dysentery that forced him to stay bent over his saddle just to tolerate the pain in his gut, while the bullet from Charles Dickinson's pistol still rattled against his lung with every breath. Complicating his misery was a fresh ball of lead lodged in his shoulder from a senseless barroom brawl with the Benton brothers, rendering his left arm useless and strapped to his side. By every rational medical standard, Jackson should have been on his deathbed at the Hermitage, preparing for the end. Instead, he was the only thing standing between the United States and total geopolitical annihilation. Against the terrifying might of the British Empire, Jackson engineered a military miracle. In less than 30 minutes on the morning of January 8, 1815, he crushed the enemy, saving New Orleans and becoming a national deity equal to George Washington. But this glory was a trap. The victory that crowned him a hero was the very thing that would drag his wife out of the shadows and destroy her. However, in the shadow of this blinding triumph lay the seeds of a profound personal tragedy that would haunt Jackson for the rest of his life. Rachel, who had stayed behind in Tennessee praying for his safety, traveled down the river to join him, expecting a quiet reunion with her sickly husband, but instead stepped off the boat into a nightmare of celebrity for which she was woefully unprepared. New Orleans was in the grip of a delirious Jackson mania, and Rachel found herself thrust onto the center stage of high society, surrounded by the aristocratic Creole belles, who looked at the short, stout frontier woman with her sun-damaged skin and rough manners with undisguised contempt. The victory that had saved the nation had also dragged Rachel out of the protective shadows of the Hermitage and placed her under a ruthless microscope, where her lack of education and the old festering rumors of her bigamy were revived as fodder for gossip in the ballrooms of the elite. Jackson, the man who had just slaughtered an empire to protect his home, found himself helpless to stop the snickering of society ladies, realizing too late that by becoming the most famous man in America, he had inadvertently exposed the woman he worshipped to a different kind of battlefield, one where his pistols and ramparts could offer her no protection at all. If the Battle of New Orleans was a contest of artillery and courage, the presidential election of 1828 was a war of ink and venom, a scorched-earth campaign that historians universally acknowledge as the dirtiest in American history. The sheer brutality of this political season stemmed from a United States that had fractured into two irreconcilable realities. On one side stood the incumbent John Quincy Adams, a man of immense intellect and aristocratic pedigree who viewed the presidency as a divine right of the educated elite. On the other stood Andrew Jackson, the wild-haired populist who represented the chaotic, terrifying energy of the rising mob. The Adams faction, led by the shrewd and ambitious Secretary of State Henry Clay, looked at Jackson and saw an American Napoleon, a military dictator in waiting who would trample the Constitution under his muddy boots. They realized early on that they could not defeat Jackson on policy, nor could they defeat him on popularity. The common man worshipped him. To stop him, they decided they had to destroy him morally. And to do that, they determined that no target was off limits, not even the pious aging woman waiting for him at the Hermitage. The assault began with what became known as the Coffin Handbills, a series of grim pamphlets bordered in black that cataloged Jackson's history of violence. They detailed his execution of deserters during the Creek War, his duels, and his summary execution of 2 British subjects in Florida, painting him as a bloodthirsty cannibal who ate breakfast on a pile of corpses. But the Adams strategists, particularly the ruthless newspaper editor Charles Hammond of the Cincinnati Gazette, quickly realized that attacking Jackson's violence was futile. In a rough and tumble frontier nation, Jackson's toughness was a feature, not a bug. They needed something more visceral, something that would offend the religious sensibilities of the voting public. They needed a scandal that touched the soul. And so, they reached back 30 years into the dusty archives of Kentucky courthouses and pulled out the file on Louis Robards. The pivot to Rachel Jackson was not an accidental drift in the conversation. It was a calculated, strategic bombardment. The pro-Adams press unleashed a coordinated narrative that framed the election not as a choice between 2 politicians, but as a referendum on the moral sanctity of the American home. The question they posed to voters was direct and devastating. Ought a convicted adulteress and her paramour husband to be placed in the highest offices of this free and Christian land? They stripped away the context of Rachel's abusive first marriage and the legal confusion of the frontier, reducing her complex life story to a single, ugly word: adulteress. Newspaper editorials described her as a profligate woman, a whore, and a source of pollution that would stain the very fabric of the White House. One particularly vicious pamphlet asked, "Shall a free and Christian people sanction the violation of the sacred marriage vows?" effectively turning every vote for Jackson into a vote against the 10 Commandments. What made this campaign so uniquely cruel was the discrepancy between the caricature and the reality. While the newspapers were painting her as a lustful seductress who had lured a young lawyer into sin, the real Rachel Jackson was a 61-year-old grandmotherly figure who spent her days supervising a plantation dairy and reading the Psalms. She was stout, deeply religious, and entirely uninterested in politics. She famously said she would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than live in the presidential palace. Yet the Adams machine transformed this gentle, reclusive woman into a national symbol of depravity. They mocked her appearance, ridiculed her lack of formal education, and circulated stories that she was a coarse, pipe-smoking savage unfit for polite society. It was a character assassination of the highest order, designed to humiliate Jackson by proving that he lacked the judgment and the moral standing to lead a civilized nation. Jackson's reaction to this onslaught was a terrifying mixture of helplessness and rage. He was a man who had solved every problem in his life with direct action, a pistol, a sword, or a lawsuit, but against a national network of newspapers, he was powerless. He attempted to build a central committee in Nashville to refute the charges, producing documents and affidavits from the 1790s to prove their innocence. But the truth was too nuanced to compete with the salacious simplicity of the lie. He tried to shield Rachel from the poison, ordering his friends and staff to screen the mail and keep the newspapers out of her sight, creating a quarantine of silence around the hermitage. He wrote to a friend with trembling fury, "I have been dragged before the public, and my domestic relations, which I have held sacred, have been violated by the ruthless hand of a desperate and unprincipled faction." However, the fatal weakness of Jackson's character, his need to protect his clan, was being exploited to its breaking point. He knew that Henry Clay, the man he called the Judas of the West, was orchestrating these attacks from the shadows of Washington, and his hatred for Clay calcified into something permanent and lethal. Jackson stopped seeing the election as a political contest. It became a crusade for vindication. He believed that if he won, the American people would be delivering a verdict of not guilty for Rachel. He pushed himself to the brink of exhaustion, driven by the desperate hope that a victory at the ballot box could scrub the stain from her name. But he failed to realize that in the new era of mass media and democratic politics, some bells cannot be unrung. The quarantine he built around Rachel was fragile, made of paper and good intentions, and it was only a matter of time before the wall was breached and the toxicity of the 1828 campaign found its way to the heart of the woman he was trying to save. By late November 1828, the verdict of the American people was finally delivered, and it was a landslide of tectonic proportions. Andrew Jackson had not merely defeated John Quincy Adams, he had annihilated the old order, sweeping the South and the West in a wave of populist fury that shattered the Virginia dynasty forever. In cities across the nation, cannons boomed, bonfires lit up the night sky, and whiskey flowed in the streets as the common man celebrated the ascension of their hero. To Andrew Jackson, this victory was the ultimate vindication, a thunderous jury verdict from the American public declaring that he was a patriot, and by extension, that his wife was a woman of virtue. He believed with the naive optimism of a man blinded by triumph that the vote had scrubbed the slate clean, that the title of First Lady would act as a shield of armor for Rachel, protecting her from the insults that had plagued them for decades. He began to speak excitedly of their move to Washington, planning a grand triumphal procession that would silence their enemies once and for all. But while Jackson was looking at the horizon, he failed to see the woman crumbling beside him. For Rachel Jackson, the victory was not a vindication. It was a death sentence. The campaign of 1828 had stripped her of her anonymity, the one thing she cherished most in the prospect of moving to Washington, the great Babylon of politics, inhabited by the very women who had sneered at her in New Orleans and the politicians who had printed the coffin handbills, filled her with a paralyzed, suffocating dread. She was 61 years old. Her heart was already weakened by years of stress, and the relentless barrage of insults had eroded her will to live. While Jackson celebrated, Rachel retreated into a deep, melancholic silence, frequently found weeping in the corners of the hermitage, clutching her Bible as if it were a life raft in a storm. She told a friend with haunting prescience, "For Mr. Jackson's sake, I am glad. For my own, I never wished it." The final blow, the dagger that would sever the last thread of her resilience, fell in December, just weeks before they were scheduled to leave for the capital. Despite her depression, Rachel felt a duty to prepare for her role as the president's wife. She traveled into Nashville, accompanied by friends to be fitted for her inaugural gown. It was supposed to be a moment of practical preparation, perhaps even a flicker of joy. However, the quarantine that Jackson had tried to build around her, the wall of silence he had constructed to keep the vicious newspapers out of her sight, finally collapsed. The details of the incident vary in historical accounts, but the emotional truth remains singular and devastating. While resting in the office of a newspaper editor friend, or perhaps in the parlor of a hotel, Rachel picked up a pamphlet that had been left carelessly on a table. It was one of the Adams campaign's most vicious broadsides, a document Jackson had successfully hidden from her for months. For the first time, Rachel read the raw, unfiltered venom that the country had been consuming. She read the words, "convicted adulteress." She read the accusations that she was a profligate woman who had seduced a young man and lived in open sin. She read the jokes about her weight, her age, and her piety. It was a physical shock, a visceral trauma that hit her with the force of a physical blow. The words that kill were no longer abstract rumors. They were right there in black ink staring back at her. Observers described the change in her as immediate and terrifying. She went silent, her face turning an ashen gray. The light seemed to go out of her eyes. When she returned to the hermitage, she was no longer the same woman. She collapsed not just emotionally, but physically. Her heart, already strained by the years of frontier hardship and the recent psychological torture, began to fail. She complained of spasmodic affections, a 19th century term for the agonizing chest pains of angina pectoris. The stress of the scandal had triggered a physiological cascade, a condition modern medicine might recognize as broken heart syndrome or stress-induced cardiomyopathy. The venom of the campaign had literally poisoned her blood. In the days that followed, the Hermitage transformed from a headquarters of political victory into a house of mourning. Jackson, terrified and confused, refused to leave her bedside. He could not understand how the triumph he had fought for was turning into ashes in his mouth. He held her hand, listening to her labored breathing, watching as the woman who had survived Indian raids, river journeys, and public scorn slowly faded away. Rachel, in her lucid moments, seemed to have accepted her fate with a tragic resignation. She did not fight for life. She welcomed the end of the pain. She told her servants and nieces that she was ready to go, that the palace of Washington held nothing for her but misery. The tragedy of this moment lies in the stark contrast between the two lovers. Jackson was a man of war, a man who believed that every enemy could be defeated with enough force and willpower. He believed he could fight death just as he had fought the British. But Rachel was dying of a wound he could not see and could not bandage. The fatal weakness of his life, his inability to protect her from the judgment of the world, was now exacting its final price. As the date of their departure for Washington approached, with the trunks packed and the carriage waiting, Rachel Jackson lay in the center of the fortress he had built for her, dying of a broken heart, killed not by a bullet, but by the accumulation of 1,000,000 cruel whispers. On the evening of December the 22nd, 1828, the air at the Hermitage was thick with the suffocating silence of impending death. Rachel Jackson had been confined to her bed for days, her breath rattling in her chest, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. Andrew Jackson, the man who had stared down British bayonets and duelists' pistols without blinking, was reduced to a trembling panic. He never left her side, holding her hands, rubbing her cold feet, desperate to transfer his own ferocious vitality into her failing body. But late that night, as the winter wind howled outside the log walls, Rachel uttered a soft cry, "I am fainting," and collapsed into the arms of her servant Hannah. By the time the doctor arrived to bleed her, a futile medical practice of the time, it was already too late. The light had vanished from her eyes. Rachel Jackson, the woman who had been the center of Andrew Jackson's universe for nearly 40 years, was dead. The reaction of the president-elect was not grief, it was a terrifying descent into madness and denial. For the first time in his life, Jackson faced an enemy he could not kill, a defeat he could not reverse. He refused to believe she was gone. When the doctor pronounced her dead, Jackson pushed him aside, insisting that she had merely fainted, that she would wake up if they just kept her warm. He ordered the servants to pile blankets on her body and stoke the fire in the hearth until the room was sweltering. For the rest of that agonizing night, he sat by her bedside, clutching her lifeless hand, waiting for a pulse that would never return. It was a macabre vigil that frightened even his closest friends. They watched the most powerful man in America reduced to a broken child, whispering to a corpse, unable to accept that the fatal mistake of their past had finally claimed its price. Only when the rigor mortis set in the following morning did Jackson finally surrender to the crushing weight of reality. He allowed the undertakers to prepare her body, but his grief instantly calcified into a cold, terrifying fury. He did not blame God. He blamed the Adams administration. He looked at her pale face and saw not a victim of heart disease, but a casualty of war. In his mind, the murderers were not biological. They were political. Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and the newspaper editors who had printed the coffin handbills and the adulterous slurs. These were the men who had stopped her heart. As he stared at her body, the tragic romance that had defined his life ended, and the revenge began. The funeral was held on Christmas Eve, a day traditionally reserved for joy, now draped in the black crepe of national mourning. It was the largest funeral in the history of Tennessee. Over 10, some say 20,000 people descended on the Hermitage. Neighbors, veterans, slaves, and political admirers swarming the grounds to pay their respects to the Lady of the Hermitage. The house was so crowded that the floorboards groaned under the weight. In a heartbreaking twist of irony, Rachel was laid to rest in the white satin gown she had purchased just weeks earlier for the inaugural ball. The dress intended for her greatest triumph became her shroud, a stark white symbol of the innocence Jackson believed she possessed and the martyrdom he believed she had suffered. At the graveside in the corner of the garden she had loved, Jackson stood supported by 2 aides, looking like a ghost himself. He was gaunt, his face a mask of tragedy, his eyes dry. He did not weep. Tears were for the sad. Jackson was beyond sadness. He was in a place of wrath. As the coffin was lowered into the Tennessee clay, he lifted his head and scanned the horizon, as if looking for his enemies in the crowd. According to legend and the accounts of those present, he spoke words that would chill the blood of the Washington establishment. He declared in a voice trembling not with sorrow, but with rage, "May God Almighty forgive her murderers, as I know she forgave them. I never will." This was not a eulogy. It was a curse. It was a blood oath sworn over an open grave. In that moment, Andrew Jackson ceased to be a mere politician. He became an avenging angel. He made it clear that he was going to Washington not to govern a republic, but to prosecute a vendetta. He would carry the memory of Rachel like a sword, and every political decision, every firing, every veto that would follow in the next 8 years would be fueled by the sight of that white dress going into the ground. He left her body in the garden, but he took her ghost with him. The Christmas funeral marked the death of Rachel, but it also marked the birth of the revenge presidency. The man who walked away from that grave was no longer whole. He was a hollow vessel filled with fire, marching toward the White House to burn down the world that had taken her from him. The arrival of Andrew Jackson in Washington, D.C. in early 1829 was unlike any presidential entry in American history. It was not a triumphal procession. It was a funeral march. The man who stepped off the carriage was not the vibrant hero of New Orleans who had saved the nation, but a gaunt, skeletal figure dressed entirely in black. He wore a heavy mourning weed, a black crepe band around his hat, and a matching band of black cloth sewn onto his left sleeve, positioned directly over the beating of his heart. He had refused to pay a courtesy call to the outgoing president, John Quincy Adams, a breach of protocol so severe it signaled the total collapse of civility in the Capitol. To Jackson, shaking the hand of Adams would be shaking the hand of a murderer. He entered the city not to govern with the establishment, but to conquer it. He was a man with a hole in his soul where his wife used to be, and he intended to fill it with the wreckage of his enemies. The inauguration on March 4th, 1829, became the physical manifestation of this new chaotic reality. It is remembered in history books as the day King Mob took the throne. But stripped of its romanticism, it was a terrifying release of pent-up class warfare. 20,000 people, farmers, frontiersmen, laborers, and slaves, descended on the capital, forming a roaring ocean of humanity that terrified the Washington elite. They saw in Jackson not just a president, but a messiah who would punish the aristocrats who had looked down on them and on Rachel. When Jackson finished his oath, the crowd didn't just cheer, they surged. They broke through the barricades and followed him back to the White House, crashing through the doors in a muddy, drunken stampede. The scene inside the executive mansion was apocalyptic. The people clambered onto the silk-upholstered furniture with their muddy boots, smashed thousands of dollars worth of china and crystal, and fought violently over buckets of orange punch. It was a desecration of the Temple of the Republic. To the horrified establishment, it looked like the French Revolution had arrived on American soil. But Jackson, the man at the center of the storm, seemed detached from the chaos. He was eventually forced to escape through a back window or side door to avoid being crushed by his own worshipers, retreating to a hotel while his stewards lured the mob onto the lawn with tubs of whiskey. This destruction of the White House interior was symbolic. The old order was being smashed to pieces, and Jackson simply watched it happen, his silence a tacit approval of the carnage. Once the mob dispersed and the mud dried, the real terror began. Jackson sat in the empty, silent White House, a building Rachel had dreaded, and initiated what would become known as the spoils system. While history textbooks often frame this as a political reform called rotation in office, designed to democratize the government, forensic analysis of Jackson's motives reveals a darker, more vindictive truth. Jackson viewed the federal bureaucracy not as a neutral engine of government, but as a nest of vipers, the very machine that had distributed the coffin handbills and the slanders against his wife. He believed that the clerks, the postmasters, and the customs officials were all complicit in the murder of Rachel because they had served the Adams administration. The purge was brutal, swift, and personal. Jackson ordered the mass firing of nearly 10% of the federal workforce, a staggering number in an era when government jobs were considered lifetime appointments. He didn't care about competence, he cared about loyalty. Men who had served since the days of George Washington, veterans of the Revolution who relied on their government salaries to survive, were thrown into the street without pension or apology. The atmosphere in Washington turned into one of paranoia and despair. One observer noted that the Capitol felt like a city under occupation, with clerks weeping in the streets and families packing their wagons in disgraced silence. Jackson personally oversaw much of this bloodletting. He sat at his desk, coughing into a handkerchief, reviewing lists of names with the cold precision of a prosecutor. When supporters of the fired men came to plead for mercy, citing the poverty of the families being destitute, Jackson remained unmoved. "I can do nothing for you," he would say, his eyes hard. He justified it as cleansing the Augean stables of corruption, but the emotional subtext was undeniable. He was punishing the system that had hurt him. He replaced these experienced bureaucrats with his own loyalists, rough men from the frontier, newspaper editors who had defended Rachel, and political operatives who had helped him win. He was building a wall of human shields around himself, ensuring that no one in his government would ever dare whisper a word against his honor again. At night, however, the revenge president was just a lonely, grieving old man. The White House, stripped of its social gaiety, became a tomb. Jackson refused to host the lavish balls that were customary for a new president. Instead, he turned his bedroom into a shrine. On his bedside table, he kept Rachel's Bible and her miniature portrait. Every night before he slept, he would remove the miniature from his pocket, prop it up against the Bible, and stare at her painted face speaking to her in the darkness. He would read the passages she had marked, trying to find the forgiveness she had possessed, but failing. He wore her locket against his scarred chest, the cold metal pressing into his skin, a constant physical reminder of his loss. The man who was terrorizing Washington by day was haunted by a ghost by night. He had the most powerful office in the land, but he had no one to share it with. And in that silence, his bitterness only grew, festering into a resolve to destroy the next target on his list, the social elite who had snubbed her. The spoils system was just the opening salvo. The war for Rachel's honor was about to move from the government offices to the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. If the spoils system was a political purge, the crisis that followed was a psychological explosion, a bizarre and destructive event known to history as the Petticoat Affair. On the surface, it appears to be a trivial social squabble among the wives of Washington politicians, a mean girls drama played out in drawing rooms. But to the forensic historian, it is the single most revealing episode of Andrew Jackson's presidency, the moment where the ghost of Rachel Jackson stepped out of the grave and dismantled the United States government. The catalyst was a woman named Margaret Peggy O'Neill Eaton. Peggy was 29 years old, the daughter of a Washington tavern keeper, described by contemporaries as vivacious, outspoken, and dangerously beautiful. She had recently married John Eaton, Jackson's Secretary of War and close confidant. The problem was the timeline. Peggy's first husband, a sailor named John Timberlake, had died at sea, rumored to be a suicide caused by shame over his wife's infidelity. Peggy had married Eaton less than 9 months later, shocking the rigid moral sensibilities of the capital. To the aristocratic women of Washington, led by Florid Calhoun, the wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, Peggy Eaton was a fallen woman, a tavern girl, who had slept her way into the cabinet. They decided to destroy her. They organized a total social blockade, refusing to visit her home, turning their backs when she entered a room, and ensuring she was humiliated at every public function. When Andrew Jackson looked at Peggy Eaton, however, he did not see a scandalous tavern girl. He saw a mirror image of Rachel, the fatal weakness of Jackson's mind, his inability to separate the political from the personal, triggered a catastrophic reaction. In the sobbing face of Peggy Eaton, who came to him pleading for help against the vicious gossip, Jackson relived the trauma of the 1828 campaign. He saw the detectives and slanderers at work again, using the same words, adulterous, immoral, whore, that had killed his wife. A terrifying logic took hold of the president's brain. He had failed to save Rachel, so he must save Peggy. Defending Peggy Eaton's virtue became a monomania, a proxy war for the honor of the dead Rachel. He told his staff with shaking rage, "I would sooner have live vermin on my back than the tongue of one of these Washington women on my reputation." The business of the nation ground to a halt. For the first 2 years of his presidency, Andrew Jackson spent more time investigating the details of Peggy Eaton's sex life than he did the economy or foreign policy. He dispatched agents to New York to interview hotel clerks about her past. He gathered evidence. And then, in one of the most surreal moments in American political history, he summoned his entire cabinet to a special meeting on the evening of September 10th, 1829. It was not a meeting to discuss tariffs or treaties. It was a trial. Jackson stood at the head of the table, looking like an Old Testament prophet, and presented his evidence that Peggy Eaton was pure and innocent. He demanded that his cabinet members force their wives to socialize with her. He demanded they accept her into their homes. It was a demand that no man could fulfill, for the wives of Washington were the true power brokers of society, and they refused to budge. When the ministers hesitated, Jackson exploded. He saw their refusal not as social awkwardness, but as treason, a direct alliance with the murderers of Rachel. The villain of this drama, in Jackson's eyes, became Vice President John C. Calhoun. Calhoun's wife, Florid, was the ringleader of the anti-Peggy coalition, and Calhoun refused to rein her in. Jackson connected the dots in his paranoid mind. Calhoun was not just a political rival. He was the head of the conspiracy that had killed Rachel and was now trying to kill Peggy. The relationship between the president and vice president, the two most powerful men in the Union, disintegrated into absolute hatred. Jackson began to refer to Calhoun with the same venom he reserved for the British. The impasse lasted for 2 agonizing years, paralyzing the executive branch. It was finally broken by the little magician, Martin Van Buren. Van Buren, the Secretary of State, was a widower with no wife to forbid him from socializing with Peggy. He saw an opportunity. He made a show of being kind to Peggy, riding horses with her, attending her parties, and treating her with exaggerated respect. Jackson watched this and loved him for it. To Jackson, kindness to Peggy was the ultimate loyalty test. Van Buren passed. Calhoun failed. In the spring of 1831, Jackson orchestrated a red wedding for his administration. In a move unprecedented in American history, he dissolved his entire cabinet. He accepted the resignations of Eaton and Van Buren to force the resignation of the Calhoun loyalists. It was a complete purge. Jackson cut the cancer out. He decapitated the political career of John C. Calhoun, effectively ending his chances of ever becoming president, and elevated Martin Van Buren to the position of heir apparent. The Petticoat affair was not a farce. It was a tragedy that reshaped the destiny of the nation. Because of Jackson's obsession with a tavern keeper's daughter, fueled entirely by his grief for Rachel, the trajectory of American leadership shifted. Calhoun, spurned and exiled from the White House, returned to South Carolina to champion the cause of nullification and states' rights, planting the ideological seeds that would eventually grow into the Civil War. Van Buren, the man who was nice to Peggy, would become the next president. Jackson sat in the empty White House after the purge, triumphant but exhausted. He had destroyed his own government to win a social argument. He believed he had vindicated Peggy, and in doing so, offered a sacrifice to the ghost of Rachel. He had proven that he would burn down the very institutions of democracy rather than let a woman be bullied by malicious gossip. The revenge presidency had claimed its first major casualties, but the fire in Jackson's belly was far from extinguished. He had purged the people around him. Now he turned his gaze toward the institutions that held the money. If the Petticoat affair was a skirmish over social honor, the conflict that followed was a total war for the soul of the American Republic. Andrew Jackson now turned his revenge presidency toward the ultimate enemy, the second bank of the United States. To the modern ear, a bank war sounds like a dry dispute over interest rates and inflation, but to Andrew Jackson, the bank was not a financial institution. It was a monster. He called it the Hydra, a multi-headed beast of corruption that sat in Philadelphia, controlling the nation's currency, bribing congressmen, and, most unforgivably, funding the very political machine that had slandered Rachel. In Jackson's paranoid but piercing worldview, the bank was the war chest of his enemies. It was the money power that had paid for the coffin handbills. It was the aristocratic fortress that protected men like Henry Clay. Destroying it was not just bad economics, it was moral retribution. He believed that by strangling the bank, he was bankrupting the men who had killed his wife. To Andrew Jackson, the bank was not a financial institution. It was the war chest of his wife's murderers. He believed this hydra was funneling money to the very politicians and newspapers that had printed the slanders against Rachel. Destroying it wasn't economics, it was moral retribution. Even as businessmen flooded the White House begging him to save the economy from ruin, Jackson turned them away with the cold fury of an avenging angel. He was willing to burn down the nation's financial system if it meant bankrupting the men who had hurt his wife. He didn't just want to win, he wanted them destitute. The violence of this era culminated on January 30th, 1835, in an event that seemingly confirmed all of Jackson's darkest paranoia. As the president was leaving a funeral at the Capitol, a place of death that always triggered his memories of Rachel, a house painter named Richard Lawrence stepped out from behind a column. He raised a pistol at Jackson's heart and pulled the trigger. Click. A misfire. Lawrence drew a second pistol and fired. Click. Another misfire. The odds of two properly loaded pistols misfiring consecutively are astronomical, a 1 in 125,000 chance. What happened next was pure Jacksonian rage. Instead of cowering, the 67-year-old president charged his assassin, beating the man senseless with his cane until aides had to pull him off. It was a moment of vivid visuals that captured his essence. An elderly, dying man, saved by a miracle, physically thrashing death itself. But in the aftermath, Jackson refused to believe Lawrence was a lone lunatic. Jackson immediately accused his political enemies. "I know who is behind this," he ranted. He publicly blamed George Poindexter, a Whig senator, and privately insisted that the assassination attempt was a conspiracy funded by the bank and orchestrated by the murderer, John C. Calhoun. To his dying day, Jackson believed the Whigs had hired a hitman to finish what the slanderers had started. The bank war ended not with a treaty, but with a cane beating and a total victory for the vengeful widower. He had killed the bank, he had beaten the assassin, and he had protected the legacy of his wife by destroying the power of those who mocked her. After Rachel's death, the last remnants of softness in Jackson's soul withered and died. The man who had once been capable of tender love became a creature of absolute unyielding iron. This hardening of the heart manifested in a terrifying coldness toward the world around him, including the Native American tribes he had once negotiated with. He no longer possessed the capacity for empathy. He had failed to secure a safe world for his wife, and in his grief-stricken madness, he decided to impose a brutal order upon the nation, regardless of the human cost. His heart had not just broken, it had calcified. By 1845, the Lion of the West had retreated to his den, but the Hermitage was no longer a fortress. It was a mausoleum for the living. Andrew Jackson was 78 years old, and his body, which had survived smallpox, bullets, sword slashes, and the stresses of the presidency, was finally collapsing under the weight of its own history. The medical reality of his final months was grotesque. He was suffering from dropsy, a severe edema caused by kidney and heart failure, which made his once skeletal frame swell with fluid until he looked like a bloated caricature of himself. He could not lie down to sleep for fear of drowning in his own lungs, so he spent his nights propped up in a special chair, wheezing and coughing up blood, the lead bullet from the Dickinson duel still lodged in his chest like a ticking clock that had finally run out of time. Yet even as his body rotted, his mind remained a razor, sharp and fixated on the two poles of his existence, his undying love for Rachel and his undying hatred for his enemies. The Hermitage had become a shrine to his departed wife. Her room was kept exactly as she had left it on that Christmas Eve in 1828, a dusty museum of grief where Jackson would sit for hours, staring at her portrait. He had finally officially joined the Presbyterian Church, a promise he had made to Rachel but delayed until he left politics, not out of a sudden fear of hell, but out of a desperate, singular hope. He wanted a ticket to the same heaven where she was waiting. He told his pastor with heartbreaking simplicity, "I want to be with her." To the very end, his theology was defined by romance. He did not seek God's face so much as he sought Rachel's. However, the revenge that had fueled his presidency burned hot until the very last breath. In the quiet moments between coughing fits, visitors would ask the former president about his time in power, expecting platitudes about the Constitution or the Union. Instead, Jackson would offer a glimpse into the dark, unrepentant furnace of his soul. When asked if he had any regrets about his 8 years in the White House, Jackson did not mention the trail of tears, the economic panic caused by the bank war, or the unconstitutional expansion of executive power. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, and delivered one of the most chilling lines in American political history. "I have only 2 regrets. I didn't shoot Henry Clay, and I didn't hang John C. Calhoun." The weight of that statement is terrifying. On his deathbed, preparing to meet his Maker, Andrew Jackson was not repenting for the lives he had taken. He was apologizing to himself for the lives he had spared. He went to his grave believing that his greatest failure was not being violent enough. He still viewed Clay and Calhoun not as political opponents, but as the murderers of his wife, the architects of the slander that had stopped her heart. The fact that they were still breathing while Rachel lay under the stone in the garden was a source of bitter, unresolved agony for him. The revenge presidency had been successful in destroying the bank and the tribes, but the personal vendetta, the blood debt for Rachel, remained unpaid in his eyes. On Sunday, June 8, 1845, the end finally came. It was a scene of drama-filled contradiction that perfectly encapsulated the complexities of his life. The man who had enslaved over 100 human beings lay dying, surrounded by his slaves, who gathered at the windows and in the room, wailing in genuine grief. They cried for the old master who had held the power of life and death over them, a testament to the strange, twisted paternalism of the plantation system. Jackson, fighting for air, looked at them and offered a final benediction that was both beautiful and blindingly ironic. "Do not cry," he whispered. "I hope to meet you all in heaven. Yes, all in heaven, white and black." In his final seconds, the man who had enforced the racial hierarchy of America envisioned a paradise where those distinctions dissolved, a final fleeting glimpse of a grace he had rarely shown on earth. At 6 p.m., his head fell forward. The old hickory finally snapped. He was buried in the garden, exactly as he had demanded, next to Rachel. But he was not just buried next to her. He had given specific instructions for his tomb. The obelisk that marks their grave is simple, but the positioning is symbolic. Jackson is buried on the side that allows him to look at her. He believed that when the resurrection trumpet sounded, the first thing he wanted to see was not the face of Jesus, but the face of Rachel. He wanted to wake up from death and pick up the conversation that had been interrupted by the words that kill in 1828. He died as he lived, a man defined less by his politics than by his passion, a warrior who burned down the world just to keep a promise to the woman he loved. When the dirt was finally shoveled over Andrew Jackson's grave in 1845, the nation breathed a sigh of relief. The storm had passed, but the fire he ignited remained. He left behind a country that was louder, angrier, and infinitely more dangerous. He created the prototype of the American strongman, teaching future leaders that anger is a fuel more potent than hope, and that a leader who fights for the people's honor will be forgiven for almost any sin. Yet at the center of this titanic legacy remains the ghost of a woman in a white dress. Without Rachel, there is no revenge presidency. The history of the United States was fundamentally altered because a grieving husband wanted the world to pay for his wife's tears. It is a sobering reminder that history is not driven by abstract forces, but by the beating, broken hearts of human beings. Andrew Jackson remains an American paradox, a father of democracy and a genocidal tyrant. But perhaps the truth is found not in the marble halls of power, but in the quiet garden of the Hermitage. He was simply a man who loved a woman so fiercely that he burned down the world when he couldn't save her.